We all like to think that in a democracy, everyone's vote has equal weight, right? But I don't know about you, but sometimes I look around and think, does my single vote really make that much of a difference? Especially when you see policies getting pushed through that really seem to benefit just a small group at the top.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? Like, we learn about one person, one vote, the power of the people, all that, but
Yeah.
then you look at the reality, especially when it comes to things like economic policy, and it feels like a different story is playing out.
Yeah, for sure. I was recently digging into this book by Jeffrey Winters called Oligarchy and Democracy, and it really got me thinking about this seeming contradiction. On one hand, we've made so much progress toward equality in areas like civil rights, LGBTQ+ rights, huge strides driven by social movements, and a broader idea of democratic participation.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at those areas, it seems like things are moving in the right direction, more inclusion, more people having a say in how society functions.
But then you zoom in on something like tax policy, for example. Time and time again, it seems like the scales tip in favor of the wealthiest individuals and corporations, even though public opinion often leans toward, higher taxes on the rich. So how do you reconcile those two trends?
That's the big question, isn't it? How does this tiny fraction of the population, the ultra-wealthy, wield so much influence, especially when it comes to their own wallets, in a system that's supposed to be ruled by the majority?
They're not exactly a massive voting bloc, are they? Winters even points out that you could fit all the ultra-rich in America into a single football stadium. It's not like they're out there marching in the streets for their economic interests. So how does this power dynamic actually play out?
Well, the core of Winter's argument, and the reason I wanted to have this deep dive today, is that the U.S. is really operating as both a democracy, A&D, and oligarchy at the same time. It's this complex interplay of two systems. And to make sense of it, you have to recognize that there are different forms of power at work.
So in a democracy, it's about participation, right? The power lies in the number of people who have a voice. But with oligarchy, it's a different kind of power altogether.
Exactly. Oligarchy, as Winters defines it, comes down to the concentration of material power, essentially, wealth. He argues that what we see in the U.S. is a constant interaction between these two forces, the few with vast economic resources, and the many with the power of their votes. The problem is that our electoral democracy, as it stands, doesn't really place effective limits on the influence of money. Actually, it seems like American democracy is particularly sensitive to it.
And here's where it gets really thought-provoking, at least for me. Winters makes this claim that the rising inequality we're seeing isn't just a natural consequence of a modern economy or a reflection of how hard people work. He says it's a direct result of redistributive policies that actually funnel wealth upwards. That was a real eye-opener for me.
It definitely challenges some common assumptions, right? The idea isn't that there's a level playing field where wealth is determined solely by effort and innovation. Instead, Winters suggests that the rules of the game are actually skewed to benefit those who are already wealthy. What he means by redistributive policies are those policies that, while often presented as promoting general economic growth, actually end up concentrating more and more wealth at the very top.
Let's dig into this concept of oligarchy a bit more. We hear the term elites thrown around a lot. What makes oligarchs different from other kinds of elites?
That's an important distinction to make. Winters makes it clear that elites can get their power from all sorts of places. Social status, education, their positions in institutions, and their goals can be all over the map. Oligarchs, on the other hand, are primarily defined by their concentrated wealth. Their power flows from their money, and their main objective, the thing that unites them, is protecting that wealth.
Wealth defense. It sounds almost medieval, like something out of Game of Thrones.
Well, historically, it wasn't that far off. For most of history, oligarchs protected their stuff through direct control of armed forces. But with the rise of the modern state, things changed. Instead of having their own private armies, the state stepped in to safeguard property rights with laws.
So the state basically took over the job of protecting the assets of the wealthy.
In a way, yes. And that was a huge turning point. It provided security for property, not just against the poor, but also against other rich folks, and even the government itself. But Winters argues that this very shift created a kind of illusion. People started thinking oligarchs didn't exist as a unified group anymore because they weren't out there leading armies.
But their need to protect their wealth didn't just disappear, it just evolved.
Exactly. The modern state, while protecting property, also introduced a new potential threat to concentrated wealth: taxes. Progressive taxation, in particular, has the potential to slow down or even reverse the accumulation of huge fortunes. So Winter's main point is that the story of oligarchy in America today is essentially a battle over defending wealth, specifically by fighting against taxes.
You know, it's funny how we tend to avoid talking directly about the link between money and power in the U.S. It almost feels taboo. But Winters points out that this connection has been understood for centuries, right?
Right. He goes all the way back to ancient Greek thinkers like Harrington and Adams, who recognized that concentrated wealth equals concentrated power, no matter what form of government you have.
So whether it's owning land in the past or stocks and bonds today, and even with everyone having the right to vote, that fundamental link between wealth and power doesn't just go away.
Nope, not at all. Winters argues that the heart of oligarchy within a democracy is this near veto power that oligarchs have on issues that threaten their wealth. On other social or political questions, their opinions are just as diverse as anyone else's. They don't have a single oligarchic stance on things like environmental regulations or foreign policy, unless those policies directly impact their bottom line. So your vote might technically count the same as a billionaire's, but their ability to influence the political system with their money is thousands of times greater. That's a fundamental imbalance that we have to grapple with.
Okay, so we've got this relatively small group with a ton of resources who are laser focused on protecting those resources. How do we even start to measure or understand the scale of that kind of power?
Winters came up with this concept called the Material Power Index, or MPI. It's a way to gauge the extent of concentrated material power by comparing what the wealthiest individuals have to what the average person has. He sets the average material power of the bottom 90% of Americans as a baseline of 1.
And when we look at the very top, what kind of numbers are we talking about?
The data Winters presents shows that the top income oligarchs have an MPI of over 10,000. He even compares this to the estimated MPI of Roman senators back in the day. And when you look at total wealth, the MPI for the richest Americans jumps to around 30,000 and even higher if you don't count home equity. Even what he calls the weakest oligarchs still have an MPI of between 125 and 200.
Wow. Okay. What does an MPI of 10,000 or 30,000 actually mean in practical terms when it comes to influencing politics?
It means that when it comes to the resources they can throw around to shape policy lobbying, campaign donations, funding think tanks, and so on, these individuals have hundreds, if not thousands of times the voting power of an average citizen. It's not about casting more ballots. It's about their ability to shape the political landscape.
The obvious counterargument is that even if individuals have a low MPI, all those average citizens could theoretically pool their resources and have more power collectively, right?
That's the classic democratic idea, the power of the many outweighing the power of the few. But Winters argues that just being poor doesn't automatically create the same kind of clear-cut political motivation and shared interests that being wealthy does. Having a lot of wealth naturally makes you focus on protecting it. Not having wealth doesn't necessarily have the same unifying effect for political action.
So the wealthy are inherently driven to protect their assets, while the less wealthy don't necessarily have that same shared motivation to act collectively.
Exactly. For the majority to really exercise their collective power in a way that rivals the power of individual oligarchs, they need to be organized, coordinated, and mobilized over long periods. This is completely different from the idea that oligarchs have to actively conspire to stay in power. Actually, it's the vast majority who have the harder time exerting their power together, while a small number of individuals each have resources that would take a massive, sustained effort from ordinary people to match.
And to make things even more complicated, Winters brings up this income defense industry. Can you explain what that is and how it fits into this power dynamic?
This is a key piece of the puzzle. Wealth isn't just sitting there. It's constantly working to protect and grow itself. The wealthy hire armies of specialists, lawyers, accountants, wealth managers who are experts at navigating the legal and financial systems to minimize their taxes and keep their wealth out of the public eye.
So it's not just about traditional lobbying to get lower tax rates.
No, it goes way beyond that. These professionals help with the defensive redeployment of wealth, using things like offshore tax havens and complex financial tools. This makes the political activity of oligarchs much more indirect and harder for ordinary people to see. And importantly, this whole industry is almost entirely funded by and serves the ultra-rich. There's no comparable industry working to represent the tax interests of the majority.
It's like an invisible shield around the wealth of the most affluent.
Exactly. And this brings us to what Winters calls the Great American Inversion, which is a really useful way of looking at American economic history over the last century or so.
All right, tell me about this inversion. What does it mean?
It refers to two major shifts. First, in the early 20th century, The U.S. introduced progressive income taxes, aimed mostly at the wealthiest. But over time, the weight of those taxes has slowly shifted down to affect a larger portion of the population. Second, there's been a complete reversal of economic progress. From the 1920s to the 1970s, average Americans saw their incomes grow substantially. But since around 1970, that growth has basically flatlined for the bottom 90%, while the ultra-rich have seen their wealth explode.
So the period when most Americans were experiencing real economic gains was also a time when the wealthy were being taxed more heavily.
Exactly. Winters describes those early attempts to tax the rich, like the 1894 income tax law that the Supreme Court eventually struck down. But then, in 1913, the 16th Amendment made it possible to bring back the income tax, initially focused on the top 1%, and the oligarchs fought back hard.
What did that resistance look like?
After World War I, when top tax rates were sky high to pay for the war, they used a two-pronged approach. First, they lobbied like crazy to lower those top rates and shift the tax burden onto people who were just well off, arguing that the government still needed money. This mass affluent group was a much bigger target, but they didn't have the same concentrated wealth to fight back effectively. Second, there was a huge increase in tax avoidance and even outright evasion among the ultra-rich. A lot of wealthy people just stopped filing their taxes.
It sounds like they were really pushing back against this whole idea of taxing wealth.
Yeah, and the government, struggling to enforce tax laws on this relatively small but extremely wealthy group, basically gave in. Starting in the 1920s, we saw big tax cuts for the wealthy, and the income tax, which was originally designed to tax the rich, gradually became a mass tax.
But then came the Great Depression and World War II. Did those crises change this trend?
Yes, those national emergencies weakened the oligarchs' influence for a while. The government needed a lot of money, so top marginal tax rates shot up, hitting 94% during World War II and staying above 70% well into the 1980s. And what's amazing is that during this time of high taxes on the wealthy, the average American's income doubled and then tripled. So it really challenges the argument that high taxes on the rich always hurt everyone's economic growth.
So what happened to reverse this trend? Why did this inversion speed up after the 1970s, leading to the levels of inequality we see today?
That's when the real economic boom began for the ultra-rich, while income growth for the bottom 90% stalled. Winters recognizes that globalization and the decline of unions played a part, but he stresses that a big factor was the compounding effect of increasingly aggressive wealth defense by oligarchs, aided by the growth and influence of the income defense industry.
So the income defense industry really took off in the 1970s.
Absolutely. It became a powerful, well-funded machine, almost entirely dedicated to serving the ultra-rich, with the main goal of minimizing their taxes and protecting their wealth. It's made up of this vast network of legal and financial professionals who are masters at finding loopholes, creating complex financial structures, and lobbying for tax laws that benefit their clients.
And their efforts go beyond just trying to lower the official tax rates, right?
Right. Another big part of their strategy is to widen the gap between the official tax rate and the actual or effective tax rate that wealthy people and corporations end up paying. The official tax rate is what you see in the law, but the effective tax rate is what they actually pay, after deductions, credits, and all sorts of tricks to lower their tax burden. By the 2000s, the effective tax rates for the top earners had dropped significantly, even though the top official rates hadn't fallen as much. The wealthier you were, the bigger this income defense spread tended to be.
They're basically using the complexity of the tax code to their advantage.
It's exactly. The income defense industry loves complexity. They often help create these intricate regulations and then expertly navigate them to benefit their clients. Things like tax opinion letters, which are basically legal arguments for not paying certain taxes based on how they interpret the tax code, become really important tools. And the scale of this is mind-blowing. The U.S. Senate has estimated that about $70 billion in taxes is avoided each year through offshore schemes alone, and a lot of that is made possible by the work of this industry.
So even though individual oligarchs might just be trying to lower their own taxes, this industry creates a sort of coordinated effort to defend their collective wealth.
Right. They may not be meeting in secret and planning everything out, but their shared reliance on this highly specialized industry gives their actions a lot of unity and effectiveness when it comes to protecting their wealth.
It paints a picture of a system where, underneath the surface of democracy, there's this powerful, less visible undercurrent of oligarchic influence, especially when it comes to who controls wealth and who pays taxes.
That's the key takeaway. American democracy, with its emphasis on equal rights and one person, one vote, exists alongside an oligarchy, where concentrated wealth translates into outsized political power, especially when it comes to protecting that wealth.
So going back to our initial question, are democratic institutions enough to stop the wealthy few from having too much influence on political decisions? Based on what we've learned from Winters, the answer seems to be not really.
Not entirely, no. And maybe not even to a meaningful extent when it comes to wealth defense. Just having formal equality in a democracy doesn't automatically mean everyone has equal political power, especially when there are such huge differences in wealth and a sophisticated industry working to protect that wealth.
It really makes you think about how our system actually works, beyond just casting a vote. Given this coexistence of oligarchy and democracy, what does it mean for the ideal of true political equality and representation? Is the current balance sustainable, or are more changes bound to happen? And what are the long-term consequences of this massive and largely hidden income defense industry on how resources and political influence are distributed in our society? These are some big questions we have to keep asking.
You've hit the nail on the head. These are the fundamental questions we have to wrestle with as we move forward. Is this the kind of democracy we want? And if not, what can we do to change course?
Great food for thought for our listeners today. Thanks for diving into this with me.
My pleasure. Always happy to explore these complex issues.